All right, this is video 2, starting on page 124. Confession for humility's sake. Most of us do not like to acknowledge our mistakes and wrongdoings. Our resistance to confession seems to be built in the fallen humanity condition. When my, Denise, children were small, my husband and I used sign language to communicate with them. One child in particular developed a significant signing vocabulary, using about 60 signs by the time he was a year and a half old. Typically, when teaching a word, we would model its sign, say it out loud, and then shape his hands into the same form. This worked well for all the signs except for one. When we tried to teach him sorry, he actively resisted our efforts to move his hand in the way that would convey the word. Even as a toddler, he did not want to communicate that he was in the wrong. Perhaps this should not have been a surprise. Confession requires honesty with ourselves and humility before others. As a result, confession is quite uncommon and often difficult for most people. We do not see it modeled by others very often, and it may even be less common among people with higher levels of responsibility and authority. And yet, confession is the tool God uses over and over again to grow us, to shape our character, and to make us into the likeness of Christ. Confession can lift a heavy burden, enable us to start anew, and remind us that God's mercies truly are new every morning. Confession, however, is not a magical elixir that removes the consequences of our actions. As we saw in the story of David and Bathsheba, and as you may know from your own life, sin has consequences that confession does not eliminate. At its heart, confession is truth-telling. It requires us to be honest about the ways we have not measured up and to admit hurt that we have inflicted on others and our Creator. This is what makes confession so difficult. It requires us to face the deeply painful truths about ourselves, but it is only in facing them that we can move beyond them. If confession were merely a tool to shape us and lift heavy burdens from our lives, then we would most likely jump at the chance to confess our wrongs and be restored into relationship with those we have wronged. Who does not want a burden-free life? But as anyone who has sinned knows, it is the consequences that we find ourselves running to avoid. We live in the shadows of Adam and Eve, hiding among the trees and not wanting to be found. We have inherited the impulse to blame others for our wrongdoing. We fear the experience of humiliation and shame and do everything we can to protect ourselves almost at all costs. We do not want to be fired, reprimanded, or written up. We do not want to know the true state of our souls and the effects of our sin-infested hearts. And so we do everything we can to avoid having the truth come to the light. This happens especially in the workplace, with those with whom we come into close contact. When we do not fess up to our ways in which we contributed to what went wrong, or work becomes something to hide behind rather than something in which we are shaped and used by God, our purposes for working gets twisted in a tradition as old as humanity. Instead of work being about joining in with what God is doing in the world, without confession, it becomes about us and what we are accomplishing. Work, which at our best moments we recognize as a vehicle for God's activity in the world, turns into a place where we hide from God. The more we regard our own worth, power, and prestige, the less we are likely to confess the places where we have contributed to the brokenness of the world. That's good. The more we regard our own worth, power, and prestige, the less we are likely to confess the places where we have contributed to the brokenness of the world. Confession is something of a paradox. We want to avoid it because of its potential to expose our weaknesses and flaws. But when we have the courage to enter into its embrace, it becomes a gift, allowing God to transform and use us. As we already mentioned, this does not mean that the consequences of our actions are eliminated through confession. At times, these consequences may be severe. This is the nature of sin. But the gift of confession is that truth-telling always frees us. In confession, we step out of hiding in Adam's shadow and into the light of God's loving kindness and grace. Telling the truth may bring with it a whole gamut of circumstances through which we would rather not put ourselves, not to mention those close to us who may also suffer from the consequences. Confession, however, also brings with it the freedom of truth. In this freedom, we can trust that none of the circumstances in our lives are wasted. Everything can be used to shape and form us for God's good purposes. Amen. All right. We're going to read the next little section because it's small. In John 8:31-41, freedom from confession. Jesus tells those who have never been in forced slavery that the truth will set you free. They dispute this. They were never slaves, so how could they be freed? But Jesus says plainly that it is in sin that traps us into slavery. Sin makes you a slave, as we saw with Adam and Eve, as well as with David. Sometimes something that is just outside of our reach is also something that can seem so enticing, capturing our time and attention as we become slaves to our desire. Our desires then dictate where we go and what we do. The truth is what sets Jesus' disciples free. It is also how we find ourselves back in God's embrace. Telling the truth about who we are, what we have done, and the ways we have hurt others is the path to freedom. When we tell God and ourselves, and we tell God and others about the ways in which we have become tangled up in sin, sin loses its grip on us. When we tell the truth, it becomes the key that unlocks the chains of lust, covetousness, jealousy, and pride that bind our lives. Like a python that suddenly discovers a different prey and lets go of whatever it's wrapped around, so confession loosens the grip that sin has had on us. To be clear, there is a distinction between confessing unintentional mistakes and confessing moral errors. Unintentional mistakes may include miscommunication, forgotten tasks, or an error in a report. Even when unintentional, these mistakes can hurt our coworkers, hold up projects, and cause frustration in the work environment. But unintentional mistakes are different from the choices we make that we know are wrong. Often the effects are different. The personal consequences are different, and how we grow from them are different. Moral errors are intentional and typically have more far-reaching impacts. They implicate the heart in ways that mistakes do not. While there is a distinction between the two, both may require confession. When we are in the wrong, whether intentional or not, confession is required. And in confession, we tell the truth, open the way to making amends and working through the issues in a way that brings freedom, restitution, and ultimate reconciliation to those involved. Of course, sometimes the truth hurts badly. Consequences ensue. We must live with the result of our actions, certainly. But freedom has always come at a price. See you in the next video.